478. That was the official death toll for 80 years. The figure now accepted is above 3,000. Some estimates go higher still. So who set 478? And why did a city defend a number its own records could not carry? This film runs on a clock, the 18th of April, 1906, 12 minutes past 5 in the morning. The shaking lasted less than a minute. Almost everything that made this a catastrophe happened afterwards over the next 3 days, and much of it was done by the people trying to save the city. This is a reconstruction hour by hour of how a city burned, and of how the count of its dead was made small enough to live with. 4 days before, on the 14th of April, two brothers bolted a camera to the front of a cable car and rode down Market Street. The Miles brothers ran a film studio at 1139 Market, and the result is 13 minutes long. It is the best surviving record of any American city of that decade, and it exists because the negative left town on a train the day before the earthquake. Watch it, and the first thing you notice is that nobody is in a hurry. Horse carts, automobiles, boys running between the tracks, men crossing without looking. The Library of Congress holds it, and it is public domain, though every frame we use here was license checked on its own record, file by file. The city in that film had about 400,000 people. It was the largest on the Pacific coast, and it was built overwhelmingly out of wood. Of the buildings that would be destroyed, 24,671 were wooden against 3,168 of brick. That ratio is not a detail. It is the reason the next 3 days went the way they did. Its water came from reservoirs down the peninsula, and the conduits from Crystal Springs and San Andreas reservoirs ran across the fault. When the fault moved, they went with it. 12 minutes and 27 seconds past 5, Pacific time. The United States Geological Survey now puts the magnitude at 7.9. The rupture ran along the San Andreas Fault for roughly 296 miles, with some measurements suggesting 310. In San Francisco and in Santa Rosa, the shaking reached the top of the intensity scale. Strong shaking lasted somewhere under a minute. Accounts differ on the exact length, and the survey's own summary says only nearly a minute. Here is what that minute did and did not do. It broke chimneys across the whole city. It dropped City Hall, a building that had taken decades to finish, into its own colonnade. It wrecked the made ground south of Market, where the city had filled a creek and built lodging houses on top. And the buildings there did not topple so much as sink and fold, and it did something quieter and far worse. It cut the water. The conduits from the peninsula broke. Hundreds of mains inside the city fractured. By one account of about 4,500 hydrants in San Francisco, 42 still had usable pressure. Treat that figure carefully. It is widely repeated and hard to trace to a primary source, but every account agrees on the shape of it. The fire department reached the first fires, opened the hydrants, and nothing came out. And the man who would have run that fight was already dying. Dennis Sullivan was the chief engineer of the San Francisco Fire Department. He had spent years arguing that the city's water supply was a single point of failure and that it needed a separate high-pressure system paid for and built before it was needed. He did not get it. He and his wife were asleep in quarters attached to a firehouse on Bush Street when the hotel next door came down through the roof. He fell through 2 floors. He never resumed command, and he died of his injuries. We are not going to dramatize that or any of the other deaths in this film. The record is thin, and the people in it were real. What matters here is structural. At the moment, the city needed one coordinating authority for fire. It lost the man who carried the map of it in his head. Within half an hour, there were fires everywhere, over 30 separate fires by the standard count, broken chimneys into wooden walls, overturned stoves, severed gas lines, lamps still burning at 5 in the morning in a city where the working day started early. One of them has a name. On Hayes Street, near Gough, a woman lit her stove to make breakfast without knowing her chimney had cracked. The fire that followed is remembered as the Ham and Eggs Fire, and it took roughly 30 blocks, including City Hall and the Hall of Records. Hall of Records mattered later, and we will come back to it. The fire burned for 4 days and 3 nights. Sources put it at 3 days of conflagration and 4 days of burning. Both are used, and they are describing the same thing from different ends. It destroyed around 28,000 buildings. The survey's figure is 28,188 across roughly 490 city blocks and about 4 7/10 square miles. The 225,000 people left homeless came out of a population of about 400,000. Now, the number that decides how you understand this event, estimates of how much of the total destruction came from fire rather than from the shaking run from at least 80% to over 95%. Put in money, total loss around $400 million in 1906 dollars, of which the earthquake alone accounts for about 80 million. So this is not mainly an earthquake story. It is a fire story with an earthquake at the front of it. And that distinction was not only historical, it was financial. And people acted on it while the city was still burning. Fire insurance was common in San Francisco. Earthquake damage was generally excluded. An Army signal officer, Captain Leonard Wildman, reported being stopped by a fireman who told him people in that neighborhood were setting light to their own houses because they had been told they would get nothing on a building damaged by the earthquake unless it was damaged by fire. That is one officer's report written close to the event. How widespread it was, nobody can say. That it happened at all tells you what the word fire was worth that week. By the afternoon of the 18th, the city had decided to fight fire by destroying buildings in front of it. The idea is sound and old. Take out a row of houses and the fire arrives at a gap it cannot cross. The execution was the problem. The demolition was largely carried out by artillery troops. Captain Lever Coleman of the Presidio Artillery led much of it, assisted by powder company men and, in places, by civilians who simply had explosives. And in the first days, much of what they used was black powder. The fire department's own reports are blunt about what that meant. Document: when black powder was exploded, it threw off a combustion that ignited all woodwork. Narration: in other words, the charge meant to make a gap in the fire made more fire. The same reports record that by the third day, they had switched to 75% dynamite in stick form, which worked because it did not burn. Individual cases are documented. At Valencia and Market, a block was dynamited and then burned anyway. On Langton Street, between Folsom and Harrison, the attempt failed outright, and the report says plainly there was no water to extinguish the flames that started after the dynamiting. So, did it help? Coleman said the fire would unquestionably have destroyed the unburnt portion of the city without it. The National Park Service, writing about its own ground, states that not all agreed and that the debate continues today. The honest answer is that the Van Ness line held and the west of the city survived, and that a considerable number of buildings burned because somebody blew them up first. General Frederick Funston commanded the Presidio while his superior was away. He did not wait for authority from Washington. He sent troops into the city on his own decision on the morning of the 18th. What the Army then did splits into two categories, and it matters that we keep them apart. The first is documented and largely creditable. Troops fought fire, ran the demolition, guarded the mint and the banks, distributed rations and water, and built the camps. Over the following 2 years, the Army put up 5,610 relief cottages across 11 camps. Peak, the camps held over 16,000 people, and the last one did not close until the 30th of June, 1908. The Van Ness firebreak was theirs. Van Ness Avenue is 125 feet wide, and on the evening of the 19th, they began taking down the mansions on its east side to widen the gap further. 3 blocks of expensive houses every 20 minutes, watched in silence by the men who ordered it. The line held. The western half of the city is still standing because of it. The second category is the one that gets repeated, and it needs handling carefully. Mayor Eugene Schmitz issued a proclamation on the 18th, printed and posted through the city. Document: the federal troops, the members of the regular police force, and all special police officers have been authorized by me to kill any and all persons found engaged in looting or in the commission of any other crime. Narration. 2 things about that document. First, the mayor had no power to issue it. The National Park Service states it directly. The mayor was not authorized to permit the shooting of civilians. Second, martial law was never declared, not by the mayor, not by the governor, not by the president. Schmitz himself later wrote that there is no martial law and never has been since the earthquake. The city ran for 4 days on an order that had no legal existence, carried out by soldiers who were not under the city's command. If you want the rest of this series, one event, reconstructed on its own clock with the sources shown, subscribe and it will find you. So, how many people were shot under an order that did not legally exist? Here, the record thins out badly, and this is the point where most retellings start inventing. The National Park Service, summarizing the reports of citizens shot as a result of the mayor's proclamation, says they vary greatly and range from 1 dozen up to 100. That is the honest span. Anything narrower than that is somebody's preference. Funston denied that any regular Army troops were involved. His superior, Major General Greeley, attributed the shootings to other units, militia, special police, citizen patrols. Each pointed at the other, and neither produced a count. 5 men were charged with murder in the aftermath. All 5 were acquitted. You will see much larger numbers repeated. 500 is a common one. It appears in popular accounts, and it is not traceable to a documented list. We are not going to use it. What can be said, and is enough, is this. An American city was policed for 4 days by armed men operating under a written instruction to kill, issued by an official who had no authority to write it, and nobody ever counted the result.
Which brings us to the number this film is named for. In 1907, 1 year after, a the San Francisco Board of Supervisors published an official death toll: 478. The first newspapers had said over 500 while the city still burned. It was not the only figure produced.
The United States Army reported 498 dead in San Francisco, plus 64 in Santa Rosa, and 102 in and around San Jose. The State Board of Health, 2 years on, put it at 503. In 1972, a federal estimate concluded that 700 to 800 was a reasonable figure, but 478 is the one that went into the encyclopedias, the textbooks, and the anniversary coverage, and it stayed there for 8 decades. Ask what could produce that number in a city where 28,000 buildings burned and 225,000 people lost their homes, and you get 3 answers. The first is administrative. The Hall of Records burned on the first day. Bodies were buried where they were found, in parks and squares, and moved later. A count assembled from what survived was always going to be short. The second is who was being counted. Chinatown was densely built, densely lived in, and it burned completely. Roughly a dozen Asian names appear on the lists of the dead. A dozen. No explanation for that has ever survived contact with the map. The third is the one the city has never really denied. San Francisco needed capital to rebuild, and a destroyed city does not attract it. A city that had a bad fire does. The people who later went through those records put it plainly. The city's political and business establishment minimized the death toll to protect the commercial viability of San Francisco. 1963, a librarian in charge of the California collection at the San Francisco Public Library was asked a simple reference question: who died in the earthquake? Gladys Hansen went to look for the list, and there wasn't one. She started building it. Death certificates, cemetery records, coroner's papers, insurance files, letters from families, church registers, newspaper notices. She was made city archivist in 1972 and kept going. By the mid-1980s, the press was reporting that her count had already passed the official figure several times over. In 1989, she and Emmett Condon, a former fire chief, published a book called Denial of Disaster. Their argument was not that the count had been sloppy, it was that the casualty figure had been dramatically and deliberately understated. Their estimate: over 3,000 deaths caused directly or indirectly by the earthquake and the fire. In 2005, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the same office that had issued the number in 1907, voted unanimously to set aside its own official death count. The resolution was co-authored by Hansen. 98 years after the fact, the city decertified 478. Above 3,000 is now the standard figure, and it is the one the Geological Survey carries. Hansen went further in her later work into the range of 5,000 to 6,000, and that upper figure is hers rather than a consensus. We are flagging that because she would have. She was still adding names in her 80s. She died in 2017, aged 91. Here is what 478 actually was. Not a mistake in arithmetic, a decision taken by a city government 1 year after the event to publish a number its own burned-out records could not support, at a moment when the city was raising money on the strength of how survivable it looked. It held for 80 years because nobody with standing had a reason to reopen it, and because the people most likely to be missing from the list were the people least likely to be asked after. It came apart because one librarian answered a reference question properly and then did not stop for 50 years. There is one more thing in the record. The Miles brothers went back. The same men who filmed Market Street 4 days before the earthquake filmed the ruins afterwards from the same street, and the Library of Congress holds both. You can put them side by side. The before is a working city on a Saturday. The after is the same camera position, and there is nothing in the frame above the height of a man. The next film on this channel is Halifax, 1917, a munitions ship, a harbor collision, and a province whose own archive names 1,782 dead, while the National Museum publishes 1,963. The list Gladys Hansen started is still open. Names are still being added to it.